Hi, welcome back to the podcast HOA Hell. I'm your host, Michael Kushner, and with me, as always, is Senior Associate from MBK Chapman, Sam Kill. Sam, good morning.
Good morning, Mike. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Well, we're back here for part 2 of our 2-part series on water intrusion or water leaks in HOAs in California. On part 1, we kind of laid the groundwork for analyzing how to analyze water intrusion events properly, okay? And we explained why classification matters, why point of origin is so important, and really what controls the analysis, and then why repair responsibility and damage liability were 2 different questions. Okay.
Exactly.
And today we're going to move from that into some of the areas that actually make water intrusion into the disputes that they are. Okay. And so this is where insurance and deductibles and relocation costs and remediation and then delays come into the formula. Okay. I will say we did promise in part 1 that one of the last things we were going to talk about were the common causes of action or legal claims that we as attorneys use in these situations, but we have found that we don't have time to do that. So we're going to skip that section entirely. And I did cover that, however, in the fact sheet that's available on our website on the topic of water intrusion. I have it. By the time this episode airs, there should be 2 or 3 fact sheets on different aspects of water intrusion. And I will or have covered that in one or more of those fact sheets. So if you're interested in pursuing that part, you can go look on the website, okay? With that out of the way, I also want to remind you guys that we're going to be using some of the same terms that we defined in part 1. And as I promised, there is a fact sheet that I've already published on the website that contains all the definitions that we talked about and contains an upgraded graphic from the one that I displayed in part 1. I actually redid it, made it a little bit more clear, easier to read, but the actual definitions are written into the fact sheet as well. So for those of you who want those, you can go onto the website for that too. So with that, let's move into insurance, okay?
Let's do it.
Insurance is a topic that's near and dear to your heart. Sam, you're always talking about insurance. And it is where often the things that HOAs say, it starts to become very misleading, okay? We told you last time, one of the most common HOA responses to a water intrusion event is, okay, go to your insurance company. Okay, take it up with your insurance. And we talked about the fact that that sort of response, or let insurance sort it out, is a shortcut. It's easy to say, but it skips the important analysis.
It's very reflexive and a source of major confusion. Yeah.
And in skipping those required steps, what you need to understand, and I hope we made clear, was insurance does not replace any statutory duties on the part of the board. No. It does not override CC&R's allocations, okay? And it doesn't excuse unreasonable or willfully, grossly negligent or willful misconduct. It just doesn't, okay? So before insurance becomes the topic to be discussed, before it's appropriate to have a conversation about insurance, you should already have done the proper analysis, which means what classification, what kinds of property were affected, where did the water leak, or where did the water intrusion or leak originate, and who's responsible for maintaining, repairing, and replacing under 4775. That's the stuff we covered last time, okay? And it's when HOAs skip that and go right to the reflex of insurance that the problem begins.
That's where we see the bad HOAs. They skip all those steps, minimal information facts provided to insurance, and then guess what? They do a cursory review and a quick analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So start today with, let's talk about insurance. Yeah. We briefly mentioned, and now we're going to go into detail, we mentioned that in water intrusion cases, this was something you actually mentioned, Sam, was that there are primarily 2 kinds of insurance that are going to be at issue in a water intrusion case. That is the master policy, which is the HOA's policy. Exactly. And then hopefully if you're in because we did say that this episode is mostly relevant to connected housing like condos and townhomes, that you have an HO6 policy. So let's talk about the master policy versus the HO6 policy, okay? These policies don't overlap.
They don't.
Cleanly, because they're designed for different things. They're designed to cover different things. So in general, The HOA's master policy covers what?
The HOA's master policy covers common area components, those that are owned by the HOA, loss claims, things of that nature pertaining to those components.
So structural stuff.
Structural stuff, right? I mean, this could be, the stucco, could be the roof, could be, the areas between walls that are clearly outside of, the purview and allocation.
Well, the separate interest.
And outside of the separate interest portion of the unit and the homeowner's responsibility.
Great, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, HO6 policies, on the other hand, which are policies that are paid for and designed to protect individual homeowners, you, the owner of the unit, cover interior finishes, your personal property, loss of use, hopefully, you've got that in there. And depending on your coverage selections, it might cover relocation costs and some other items. But basically, it's there to fill in the gaps that the master insurance policy on the HOA won't cover, okay? And so it's all your stuff, okay? That's what's important there. Neither policy answers anything about responsibility.
No.
Nothing.
No.
It is who's paying for repairs or damage. Mm-hmm. That's what it does, okay? Coverage depends on policy language, obviously. We always say, depending on if your policy covers this, because there are, you guys know as well as I do, that one of the favorite things insurance companies like to do, it's their favorite activity in the world, is to have as many exclusions as possible so they don't have to cover as much as they can get away with. You know that. Okay, it is a game to them, and so you should treat it that way and read your policy carefully. Mm-hmm. Okay, so because of that, telling a homeowner to just go to your insurance and let them deal with it, that explains why it's just a dumb way to analyze things. Okay, because you can't. Every HO6 policy is going to be different. Okay, generally, they cover personal property. They cover the same things, but some cover relocation costs, some don't. Some cover remediation, some don't. There might even be an exclusion because you had, these issues in the past and they were now excluding it. Who knows? Okay, which is why you got to have a good agent. Talk to your agent about what you want. I want coverage that'll cover this, 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 and this, and it's your agent's job to make sure you get that. And then read your policy, and more importantly, read the exclusions.
Exactly.
There's separate pages for that. Here are all the things that we will not cover. That's the important part. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Anything else on insurance? Are we good?
I think that's good. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about, and we touched on this briefly. We defined in our definitions in part one the difference between real property and personal property. Mm-hmm. But now let's talk about real property and personal property losses. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. So remember, though, and I'm going to be as brief as I can. When the CC&Rs, and we did this in part one, when the CC&Rs are silent, and they almost never are, but we're creating that world where they are just so we can make our example. If your CC&Rs are completely silent on the issue, then Civil Code 4775 will control, okay? And we talked about what 4775 says about common area, about your separate interest, and about exclusive use common area. I won't repeat it again today, okay? And then we talked about classification and point of origin, and I won't repeat that again. Okay, so now let's go to the third thing that homeowners can consider, and that's making sure that you keep two separate questions separate, right? Who must repair the failed component and who's liable for resulting damage? Mm-hmm. And we touched on that in part one as well.
We did. Mm-hmm.
So nothing that we're about to talk about replaces anything we said in part one. Mm-hmm. We are adding layers, okay? Everything we're about to discuss sits on top of all that. So now let's talk about real property versus personal property when it comes to the distinction between the insurance, deductible fights, and cost shifting, okay? On paper, both the HOA's master policy and your HO6 policy exist to address different pieces of the same issue. Yeah. The issue being the water intrusion event, okay, the water leak. And obviously, there are going to be gaps and overlaps because they have different meanings. Hopefully, between the two of them, you got everything covered.
Yeah.
That's the idea. Ideally, between the master policy by the HOA and your HO6, everything's covered. Real property, the structure, the roof, the walls, the stucco, the whatever, your personal property, your relocation, remediation if that's an issue, at marges, whatever, there you go, okay? Anything you want to add?
No, just that's the ideal standard. Oftentimes, unfortunately, you don't have that being the case.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And by the way, we're not here to discuss the ins and outs or the good and the bad of insurance.
Yeah.
Or insurance companies. We could do a 15 or 20-part episode on insurance nightmares. This podcast is not called Insurance Hell.
It could be highly technical, too.
It's called HOA Hell. So we're not going to go into any of that, okay? Now, we gave you those 2 questions a minute ago, and those are what we talked about in part 1. Now, let's fine-tune 2 new questions for today that takes into account the insurance aspect, okay? And that is, who opened let's put it this way. The correct questions at this stage of the analysis are not the following 2 questions. These 2 questions are not the correct questions. Who opened a claim first?
Yeah.
And which carrier is involved? I don't care about the answer to either of those.
Yeah.
Those are the wrong questions. Those are questions your HOA might want because that helps them deflect from responsibility, okay? The correct questions, and there are 3 of them, are as follows. Which components, the CC&Rs and or Civil Code 4775, whichever is relevant, require the HOA to repair or replace? Maintenance isn't an issue here. When you've had a water intrusion, maintenance is no longer relevant. Can this be repaired? And if not, it has to be replaced, okay? So which components do the CC&Rs and or 4775 require the HOA to repair or replace, whichever the case is? 2, which categories of loss fall outside those repair obligations and fall on the insurance company, okay? And those can overlap.
That's right.
If it's the HOA's responsibility, then the master policy will probably kick in at that point. And so it becomes the insurance is requirement. So those questions are different questions, but they often are the same answer, okay? And last, did the HOA, was there any conduct on the part of the HOA or the homeowner, but we're focusing on the HOA because this is about bad HOAs, right? Was the homeowner's conduct before the water intrusion event or after the event occurred? Did it create or expand liability for damage?
Yeah.
What do I mean by that? Well, did the damage to your interior or your personal property or to the exterior or any common area or exclusive use or anything get worse as a result of conduct after the water intrusion? For example, a long delay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or denying entry for repairs.
That's right. Well, that would be on you.
Yeah.
That would be the homeowner. We're talking about HOA.
Right. Yeah.
Keep in mind, folks, we did talk about, those obligations that you have as homeowners following a water intrusion event. And we talked about the fact that every water intrusion event, by definition, in my opinion, is an emergency.
Exactly.
So if the longer a delay occurs between the time of the report and the time that, for example, the water is stopped or things are opened up and dried out, if that's applicable, or repaired, the more damage can occur. That's what we're talking about, post-water intrusion damage, okay? Skipping those kinds of questions is a tactic that bad HOAs will use to deflect responsibility and to shift the burden and shift responsibility. Skipping those questions and directing homeowners to their insurance accomplishes the same thing. Keep that in mind. Don't let that happen. That's why we keep hammering that home, okay? Insurance is going to address who has to pay for something, but it doesn't reflect, and this is what I was trying to say a minute ago, it doesn't reflect repair obligations. Who's obligated to repair? It just reflects who's going to pay for those obligations. That's what I meant when I said that those first 2 questions were tied together. Yeah. An HOA that's responsible for repair or replacement is going to turn to their master policy to pay for that. And hopefully it's covered. Otherwise, special assessment time, okay? So the obligation belongs not to the insurance company, to the HOA, but the payment obligations to the insurance company because of contract, okay? All right. Insurance policies, do you agree, control the mechanics of coverage. So they say whether a loss is covered. And they say, here's what we're going to cover and here's what we won't cover. And they do so within the confines of a deductible if there is one, and they can be sizable. And then how that deductible is applied. There are some things that are not subject to a deductible.
Correct.
Again, whatever your policy says.
Yeah.
The CC&Rs control something very different. Your CC&Rs control who ultimately bears responsibility as between you and the HOA,
Correct.
your HOA, okay? For example, many CC&Rs, not all, but many, expressly allocate deductible responsibility to one or the other.
They do.
To the homeowner or to the HOA. And when they do that, the allocation and the CC&Rs is going to govern. Insurance companies are not going to say the deductible must be paid by the HOA or must be paid by the homeowner. It's none of the insurance company's business. They're just going to say there's a deductible. We don't care how it's paid. That's just you pay that first before we give you $1. That has to be covered. That first amount in loss. So whatever amount in covered loss, let's say it's a $5,000 deductible. The first $5,000 in covered loss will not be paid by the insurance company. It'll be paid by whoever the CC&Rs allocate that responsibility to. Yeah. So the insurance company has no say in how that's allocated. They just have a say in how much it is and that they need to get paid first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and oftentimes you have a payout and then that portion is withheld. But, depending on who bears the responsibility. If it's the homeowner, then the board will receive the full payment from the insurance company, and then they will withhold the deductible portion of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what this leads us to is when you're talking about when the issue of the deductible comes up, and if your HOA is trying to, in those cases where your HOA is trying to say the deductible is on you, you have to cover that. So your insurance will have to cover that part of the deductible. Don't just take your HOA's word for it. Ask them, fair enough, where in our CC&Rs does it say that? Now, it's what we just said a minute ago. It's very possible that it will say that. But it has to say it explicitly. It has to say, in an event of a loss, blah, blah, blah. This is just an example, but in the event of a loss, the deductible shall be borne by the involved homeowners. Okay, that is a way of allocating the deductible.
Right.
If they can't point, if your HOA has tried to foist responsibility of payment of the deductible on you, i.e. really your insurance company, but still, then, and they can't point to a provision in the CC&Rs that says that, then the default is the deductible's on them, okay? So I push back. Don't just accept the HOA's word for it. They might actually be telling the truth. They might be right. Just confirm that is all I'm saying.
Just a brief addition. Many communities also have a water intrusion policy, and so they may also have that contained in that policy.
Say that again?
Many communities also adopt a water intrusion policy, and so they may also have provisions pertinent to that issue.
It doesn't have to be the CC&Rs in this case, like it does when it comes to maintenance, replacement, and repair responsibilities. That is CC&Rs only.
Yeah.
This could be any governing document. So I used CC&Rs as a shortcut. I shouldn't have done that. I wasn't precise. So any questions on the deductible issue? We're racing through this stuff to get through everything we want to get through today.
Good pace, yeah.
Okay, so again, guys, deductibles exist. Almost every single loss is going to have some sort of deductible involved. The issue about who has to cover that deductible is going to be something that's in your governing documents. If it isn't, it's your HOA. If it is, then ask them to point out where. And once you've confirmed it is, then you go to your insurance and say, hey,
exactly,
we have to cover this part of the deductible. Insurance will know that because they'll have a copy of master policy if they need one. Okay. I think that's all on that issue. Now let's talk about the most asked question when it comes to a water intrusion policy, or I'm sorry, to a water intrusion dispute where the property, until it's fixed or until it's repaired, replaced, is no longer fit to be lived at, either because it's unsafe, mold, for example, which we'll talk about next, or because it's not habitable because, let's say, because of the process of fixing or whatever destruction occurred, you no longer have a bathroom. Say you have a condo with a single bathroom. If you no longer have use of a bathroom, you can't live there because you need to have washing facilities and toiletry facilities. So we're going to talk now about this issue that comes up when the homeowner has to move out for a period of time and go somewhere else while repairs are being made because it is no longer livable following a water intrusion event. And that is relocation costs.
Exactly.
This is the source of the most, I think, the most needless dispute and stress. And fortunately, it's almost always very, very easy to resolve because there's a statute directly on point, and that would only be countermanded by something in the governing documents. And then even if there is no relocation coming to you, if you have a good HO6 policy that has it, you're covered anyway. So that shouldn't really be a source of stress. So we're going to de-stressify.
Yet it is. It's so misunderstood and common and frequent stress.
So we're going to de-stressify and we're going to give you the facts now. Relocation usually becomes an issue after water intrusion's underway.
Yeah.
By definition. There's no relocation issue before a water intrusion event occurs. Everything's fine. It's once it occurs that it could become an issue. So there are two, generally the most common ways that you would have to vacate your property would be if you have a destruction of something that's necessary for life, like a bathroom, or you have, in the context of fixing or remediating, it makes it unusable. Those are the only two that I can think of, okay? Yeah. So with the latter, drying, demolition, mold growth while it's being remediated would necessitate you getting out.
Correct.
Okay? Mm-hmm. What often surprises homeowners is, because it's a very reasonable thing to assume, that the HOAs, let's say the leak originated in the common area. I'm giving you a fact scenario so that you can understand why this is completely reasonable. The water leak originated in the common area, no dispute. It caused damage to your property and to your personal property, no dispute. It necessitated, there was enough standing water that there was a mold concern and mold growth. Let's say there's no dispute there. You must move out in the time that things are being remediated and repaired, no dispute there. So it is very natural and normal for a homeowner to come to a very logical conclusion that, okay, HOA seems to be at fault here, not because they were negligent, just because they are. They should be covering my hotel, or my temporary apartment somewhere, my relocation costs.
Yeah.
And the actual fact is the opposite is true. Okay, we've been talking in this in part one. We cited Civil Code 4775 routinely, and we cited it a couple times today. I'm going to cite it again right now.
Subsection C.
Subsection C.
Yeah.
Specifically, explicitly states that relocation costs are borne by the homeowner, period. Okay? So that's it. Relocation costs are up to the homeowner. Now, if there's nothing in the law that says that CC&Rs can't override that, okay? I haven't seen a pair of CC&Rs that say this, not lately. I don't think I've seen it in years. I can't think of one off the top of my head. Let's put it that way. I'm sure I have, but I can't think of one in particular. But I'm not going to disallow the possibility that there could be a set of CC&Rs that, or a water intrusion policy or something that says that the HOA will cover the reasonable expenses associated with relocation if the water originated or the damage originated in the common area. It's possible. I just can't think of one. Okay? But there's nothing stopping a group of homeowners, especially in a small HOA with 5, 6, getting together and having that in there. Why not? I could see it. So I can't think of one, and that's not what the default position of the law doesn't. It has the opposite. You're responsible no matter who's at fault.
Yeah.
Okay? Subject to an exception we'll talk about in a minute. Okay? Because there are occasions when relocation costs do become the responsibility of the HOA. And
Eventually. Yeah.
We'll talk about that in a minute. But absent what we're going to talk about in a minute, absent that exception, it's on you, which means it's hopefully going to be covered by your HO6 policy. Yeah. You agree?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
So that default rule is the opposite of what you would consider natural, normal, intelligent, and reasonable, and that is, even if it's the HOA's 100% fault that this occurred, you're still responsible. And if you don't have an HO6 policy, or you don't have, your HO6 policy doesn't cover relocation costs, and I really can't imagine that being the case. I don't think I've ever seen one that didn't, but I know that there are out there that don't.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't, it's coming out of your wallet, coming out of your pocket, unless you fit into one of the exceptions that we're going to talk about in a minute, or your CC&Rs are 1 in a million that say that the HOA will cover it, but chances are it won't. So 4775C applies. Okay. Now let's go to that exception. Okay. Tell me about that exception.
Well, that exception is post the initial displacement or relocation. If there's an undue delay, or let's say some kind of a expansion of damages that lead to further delays, is contributed to by the HOA, meaning they were derelict, they were negligent, they were not timely dealing with the heightened sense of urgency in terms of their remediation, restoration, and doing their utmost to reasonably move things along. Right. If they contribute to that, you're amplifying the issue, you're not mitigating damages, so it's a peril that you are creating and expanding at that point.
In other words, and you're exactly right. You're in a hotel, let's say, you're paying for it. It's coming out of your pocket. And the HOA is sitting on, the HOA isn't responsive to its own contractors about getting, getting access to your location. Let's say, hey, the HOA has the key to your unit, let's say, to let them in. Isn't making it easy, is delaying. It's, days and days are being added to this remediation and repair situation because your HOA is just not taking it seriously enough or hasn't appointed someone to manage that, which they should do is appoint a director to handle that as a liaison for the board and make sure things are moving along swimmingly. Or remediation. They're taking their time finding a licensed company to come and remediate. And all of a sudden, what should have been you in a hotel for a week is now turned into a month.
Or management's tasked with it, and then now they're transitioning from one management company to another, and the directors drop the ball, and then meanwhile you have months of delay.
Right, and that's actually happened in some of our cases, that exact scenario. Yeah. So at that point, you're going to still pay those relocation costs, but I promise you that if you take legal action, that's one of the causes of action that we include is to get that compensated back to you. Yeah. At that point, you are entitled to whatever part of the relocation was deemed to be unreasonable or unnecessary. If it's at the fault of the HOA, then the HOA is going to have to repay you for that portion. Okay? And of course, it'll be the HOA's insurance that does that, but who cares? You get paid back.
And by the way, oftentimes your HO6 also has coverage that's up to a limited reasonable period of time. Now, assuming you have coverage, so that too speaks to that issue. Now, if you go well beyond that, you've put them on notice, then guess what?
Right.
Supports your cause.
There are people who are qualified to testify in court if necessary as to how long repairs of a specific sort are supposed to take. And so there is an answer. How long should X take? There's an answer for all of those. And if the answer is less time than the HOA, or less time than it took, and it was because of the HOA, they're going to cover those. As an element of your damages, they will cover those relocation fees that are associated with the delayed part, not the original part. So let's say the answer to that question by an expert is a week, and it was 3 weeks. You're still going to pay that first week. But the 2 weeks that you had to pay on top of that, that's going to come back to you from the HOA if you pursue this legally. Because if it's deemed to have been the HOA's fault that the extra 2 weeks happened, then they're going to pay for the extra 2 weeks.
As well as other damages, which your fact sheet does a fantastic job of addressing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, so it is fair to say, based on what Sam just said, that delay on the part of the HOA, in this case, is the driving factor in whether that exception will apply, and if so, to how much of the relocation cost will it apply. In our example I just gave, it'll apply to 2 of the 3 weeks worth of relocation costs. Relocation costs, by the way, include not just the cost of your hotel or temporary apartment, whatever it is, but your per diem for food, water, whatever, the necessities of life.
Exactly.
Okay. So this is why it's because of this, because time matters here. Again, water intrusion, every day you're paying for a hotel per day or an apartment per day. Relocation disputes and their expenses associated escalate very quickly, okay? Because it's a constant ongoing expense.
Correct.
And what you want to avoid at all costs for your pocketbook is what should be a short disruption turning into a months-long disruption. And again, as Sam just said very astutely a minute ago, a lot of these SO or HO6, I say SO, I don't know what I'm thinking of, HO6 policies that do have relocation provisions have limits on them. They're only going to pay for relocation up to X amount of days or X amount of weeks. And there's a reason for that. They have actuaries that make the same analyses that the expert I was just talking about will make.
That's right. Yep.
Okay. So at that point, if you reach into that situation where you're now running out of insurance and it's really coming out of your actual pocket, then these relocation disputes are no longer logistical at all or just inconvenient. At that point, it's becoming a damages issue that's tied directly to how the HOA responded and handled to this issue, to this problem. Okay? All right. I don't think anything to add on relocation. Are we good?
I think we did a good job covering that. Yeah.
All right. Now let's move on to another big bugaboo when it comes to moisture. And we're going to talk about some myths. Yeah. And we're going to talk about reality. Okay? And that is mold, moisture, and how in certain cases where mold is an issue, delay can be dangerous and costly. Let's start with the biggest mold myth there is, and that is this. We hear this every day. Okay, water intrusion is a big deal. Even in California, by the way, we're considerably drier than most other states, but it's still a very, very common issue in California. And here's the biggest myth out there. A water intrusion event occurs, and therefore mold is inevitable. That is not true.
No.
Not every water intrusion event results in mold. Let me give you a real life example. My house. So recently, a year ago, I noticed that my brand new painted baseboards in the living room were bubbling up. The paint was bubbling. And it was obvious, and I didn't have MDF there, I had actual wood. I could see there was water intrusion. What it turned out is that the pipe outside, because this was on the edge of, obviously, because it's a baseboard, it was on the edge of the wall. The other side of the wall is the outside. And the pipe from the drains in my yard to the street was clogged and hadn't been flushed by my landscaper, like they should have been done. And so water pooled up there and then got into the foundation or got into the, through the stucco and came into my house. Okay. I noticed it immediately. We got within 1 day, I had the lines flushed, and I had my contractor come out, pull up just the baseboards that did that, replace that part of the baseboard, repaint. They didn't have to rip open the wall and dry anything out because it was a one-time water intrusion that was addressed immediately. Mold grows when water, basically, I'm gonna give you the shortcut. Water times time.
Yeah.
Water times time equals mold.
Yeah.
Water that is dried because the source stops and there's sufficient airflow to stop the water from staying wet forever. Yeah. So water or moisture times time, I should say.
Or a perpetual, flow of water that accumulates and sits. And
so if the moisture remains moisture times a period of time, or if there's a continuous flow, there's a constant pinprick leak, or a constant source of water. It doesn't have to be a deluge. It can be just drip, 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 but it's constantly staying wet. That's when you get mold problems. You do not get mold from a one-time water event that then dries naturally. Mm-hmm. Inside your walls, things will dry. So I didn't have to rip up my wall to do any remediation. I just had to stop the water source, which I did immediately, and pull up the damaged part, replace just that part. We were done. Same thing. I had a small roof leak, and I could see the paint bubbling up in the living room ceiling. And I called my roofer, came in, patched a couple of tiles, did some tar paper stuff. Whatever. There was a couple of little, I guess some of the shingles had moved, or the coverage wasn't perfect. Fixed it up, no problem. He didn't have to open up the whole ceiling. The water, it wasn't a moisture wasn't there and building up over a period of time. Mm-hmm. It was a one-time event. It rained, it came through. Yeah. It was immediately evident. We fixed it, replaced it, we were done. No mold. So mold does not, or water intrusion does not equal mold. But if the water isn't drying, either because there's a constant source of water or because there's literally no airflow and it remains moist for a period of time, then you start to get mold. Now, mold will affect different people differently. Some molds are more dangerous than others. Black mold is really bad, right? And some people are much more susceptible to mold. Yeah. You could have one person in a household that isn't affected at all by a mold outgrowth, even if it's black mold and it's bad mold. And then you could have somebody in the same household that has asthma or some other respiratory condition.
Immunocompromised respiratory conditions, yeah.
Some other respiratory condition that is drastically affected by the mold. So mold will treat different people differently. But mold, when it's growing and there, is something that has to be addressed, whether or not you notice symptoms or not. Because mold by itself never gets better. It doesn't just decide to go away. Mold might stop spreading, or it might slow. I would say it would slow spreading, but it will never clean itself up. Okay? So if there's mold, it has to be addressed because you never know who's going to be more susceptible to that. And when you're immunocompromised, when you have a respiratory condition, it can be uncomfortable all the way to life-threatening, depending on the seriousness of the mold, the amount of mold, the amount of air spores that are floating around, and the specific health condition of the individual involved. Okay? You don't have to have, I didn't mean to say that you had to have dramatic flooding to lead to mold. You can have a pinprick leak lead to mold. It's the moisture over time that leads to mold.
And pinhole leaks are rather common and continuous, so that's where you encounter them the most.
That's right.
And by the way, HO6 policies, not to go back to that, oftentimes have exclusions for continuous specifically, right? So
that's right, which is a shame.
Yeah.
It shouldn't, and you really want to look at your policies and make sure you get some sort of rider. Yeah. You want normal, so burst pipe, almost always covered. Pinprick leaks, or leak in the soldering, where the joints of the pipes, depending on the kind of piping you have, might very well have an exclusion. Try to get a rider that actually covers that, because that's very expensive to repair also.
Yeah.
Okay. I had that situation in a condo I owned that was a rental. My tenant called me, said, hey, water's dripping down from the ceiling. I got a plumber in there immediately to stop the leak. I went to my insurance, found out that wasn't covered. I changed insurance after that, but found out that wasn't covered. I paid for it. I had to get it fixed. I took care of it immediately. Great. Okay, no problem. But I really wish it would have been covered. Fortunately, it wasn't huge, but it could have been. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mold can be, when you have mold, problems arise when it's ignored by the HOA or you, depending who's responsible. When there's a delay in drying, give me some more scenarios where the problem becomes worse.
Well, delay in drying, when there's a delay in addressing it and getting people in to do the remediation restoration, bringing humidifiers, for instance.
Right. So it's not enough to open up the wall. It's not enough to put the fans there.
No.
There also has to be other remediation. You have to have the dehumidifiers.
Right.
And maybe even, depending on...
Did I say humidifier? Dehumidifier.
Yeah, dehumidifier. Yes. And then depending on how bad the mold is, maybe a spore test, an air test.
And that has to be done in a way that's compliant with various laws. And
can the handyman do it?
No, absolutely not.
Would you trust a general contractor to do it?
No, they're not duly qualified.
There are licensed companies. They're often known as restoration services.
Mm-hmm.
There are restoration companies that have very specific training and licenses for water intrusion and mold remediation.
Exactly.
They are specialists. They know how to wrap, if it's bad enough and there's enough air spores, they know how to wrap your clothes up properly so that they can get it to the cleaners. They know how to take care of furniture so that it can be revamped and taken care of, because mold will settle. If there's spores in the air, it can affect everything and make everything a death trap for somebody.
Compartmentalizing the areas they work on. I mean,
they create bubble boy rooms.
Exactly.
Right? They create bubble boy rooms.
Yep.
They're experts in doing that. Not to say that the general contractor or handyman might not know how to do it, but they're not supposed to do it, and they're legally not allowed to do it.
Right.
You got to have a licensed professional doing everything that requires a license, and this does. Mm-hmm. So make sure, whether it's you or your HOA, you go and check that license. You have a right to know that.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
If your HOA is responsible and is providing we've had HOAs try to have their handyman come in and do the remediation, and we've sent in letters saying, rejected, we're not going to give you entry.
Yeah.
You get a licensed remediator, and we've given them 3 names of companies that we trust. And if you don't pick from one of these, or you don't pick your own that has the same license, you're not coming in, and we're going to sue.
Small HOAs. I see this all
very
the time.
much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that.
Well, in small HOAs, you oftentimes have board members who claim to have some degree of knowledge or experience, and they want to save the association, a couple of bucks essentially, and they lack the knowledge of the Davis-Sterling Act and operative law and what they're supposed to do. They barely check with insurance, and so what they do is they are very cavalier about all of this, and they offer thinking that they're being a person of good conscience and operating in good faith, but they're doing more damage. And running afoul of so many different legal requirements.
I have one in mind in particular where we had an HOA director who claimed to have a tremendous amount of knowledge and expertise on mold remediation. Mm-hmm. No license, by the way. Happened to own a restoration company, which I would have then said, yeah, okay, I'll give you that. But no, and the rest of the board was like in awe of this person's knowledge and just basically rubber stamped everything he said, and he was just freaking wrong. Okay, and wanted to use a non-licensed company. And it's not happening, buddy. First of all, you're not nearly as smart as you think you are. And even if you were, you're not licensed, so you're irrelevant. And even if you were licensed, there's a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And so it's not going to be you or your company that does it. So shut up and let the professionals come in and do the work. Sit down, be quiet, have a lollipop. Okay?
No matter whether the board president's spouse, husband in this case, use a garden sprayer and just use bleach to treat mold at someone's unit and forgot to follow all protocols. I mean, this is someone who's not even a licensed professional.
And didn't bother testing, like, how bad is the mold? How far is it sprayed? Because you open up a wall, you see mold, you spray it there. But did you look to see whether or not 8 feet to the left of that, there's also continuing mold? See, remediators know some of the signs on whether mold is continuing. They know how much wall to open up.
Yeah.
They don't just open up the whole wall and hope for the best. They know how much wall to open up. This handyman person had no idea. And if it were me, like, look at sometimes if you have when I had an apartment, when I was in college, let's say I had an apartment and I used to get mold on the grout, in the bathtub, and I would routinely once a week I would take my bleach and spray it, and that was how I treated it. That's what I knew how to do, and I probably kept it at bay. Right? I think I did a reasonable job to keep it at bay.
Yeah.
But that's not what you want for your house when you've got real mold growth and it's, or God forbid, it's the dangerous kind of mold.
Yeah.
And by the way, did that handyman do anything to determine how bad the mold was at that point and whether or not it had already formed spores in the air and whether or not the air was actually safe to breathe? Right. No, of course he didn't. He wouldn't know how to do that.
Exactly.
Okay. So mold is where routine water intrusion can become a health hazard and become dangerous. And can increase costs significantly because remediation is not cheap. Okay? Now, we've kind of covered on each of these individual aspects, we've covered how delay is kind of at the forefront of all the dispute-causing
Huge
issues.
variable,
Okay?
massive, yeah.
So how does delay change the entire case? Even when intrusion was not caused as a result of HOA fault, the unreasonable delay on the part of the HOA, as we've said numerous times, after notice, creates new exposure, right? We talked about that. And at that point, the issue isn't necessarily just the origin or the source, right? It's how the HOA responded once it knew was a problem. So delays typically show up in a variety of ways, and they're pretty predictable, okay? I'll start with one, and you give me one that you can think of, okay? Yeah. A slow or incomplete investigation after written notice of a water intrusion event can cause delay. Yeah. What else?
Another delay is if they reflexively put the onus or burden on you to do, items X, Y, and Z before that triggers their response to engage their vendors. Yeah.
Exactly. Another one is if they refuse to open up walls or inspect concealed conditions when the circumstances warrant them opening up the walls or looking at those concealed conditions.
Right.
Okay. Give me another one.
Well, one that I encounter, and I don't know if you have this itemized, is when a homeowner has legitimate questions, concerns, for instance, before they immediately relocate if they have to, and there's a delay in addressing those and then shifting the blame on them for being the cause of no action or inaction.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Here's another one. Minimizing moisture issues instead of addressing them promptly. Okay?
Yeah.
Not recognizing the emergency-ness. That's not a word.
Urgency of it.
The urgency of it, right.
Yeah.
I like emergency-ness. If there's a gap between notice and action, that's a problem. Or treating water intrusion as a routine maintenance issue, like your handyman situation, instead of something that requires professional immediate attention.
Correct.
Or, to say it better, immediate attention by a professional.
Right.
Okay? Delay matters because it allows damage to spread. It allows... it prolongs unsafe conditions when we're talking about mold, and it drives secondary losses, okay? For example, the extra expense associated with your relocation. That is a secondary loss to the main water intrusion loss.
Correct.
Okay?
Yeah.
Or it can cause another example of secondary loss is increased damage to something, to structure or personal property.
Yeah.
Okay? When that happens, that post-notice conduct by an HOA, or you, but we're talking about HOAs, becomes a cause of a whole new set of damages, 100% of which will be the responsibility of the HOA, regardless of origin.
Right.
Okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's why it is so critically important for you to follow our mantra, our advice, which is written notice, document, timelines, keep your log, written follow-ups, all the stuff we talk about when it comes to writing something down and having a record. That's what we're talking about. Yeah. It is so critically important because you can't prove any of those things if you don't have that.
Exactly.
Okay? Now, let's give the homeowners, our listeners, specific things they can do when their HOA is delaying or stalling. Okay? When an HOA delays or minimizes, stops engaging with you, they decide you're taking too much of our time, you're too much of a pain in the butt.
Right.
Or you're telling us things we don't want to hear. Okay?
Or them just having fatigue with you is not a valid basis.
When they do that, then you need to understand it's time to shift from waiting to documenting to acting.
Exactly.
Okay? So at this stage, if you get to that stage, and hopefully you don't, but if you do, and you will if it's a bad HOA, time for theory, the time for analysis is over. Okay? The goal is to preserve, leverage, and force action on the part of the board. Force movement, something. Okay? If your HOA is delaying, minimizing, playing games with you, then take the following steps and do all of this in writing. I'll start. You can add one.
Okay.
1, provide clear written notice describing down to the detail, the nature and scope of the water intrusion, the affected areas, and any visible conditions that resulted from water intrusion. Okay, describe that all in writing very clearly. Give me another one.
Well, obviously, I mean, I think I was going to give you a different one, but you're okay. Photographic evidence. I mean, take recordings, video recordings, photographic timestamp recordings, or snapshots of, any conditions, anything that's pertinent.
What you see.
But the one I was going to add, Mike, is...
Well, I want to comment on that one first.
Okay, go.
So when we're talking about photographs and videos, get your iPhone out. You don't need a special camera. Get your iPhone out and videotape the water intrusion. Videotape the bubbling paint or the whatever. Or if you opened up the wall and there's mold, take pictures of that. Send the pictures and video as part of your written report to the board saying, this leak started, when it started raining last night. Here's a picture of the leaking coming in my living room. Here's a picture of the bucket. Here's a picture of the paint that's now bubbling. I don't know what the origin is yet, but it's coming from up there. It could be the neighbor. It could be the roof. Either way, I need you to investigate ASAP since I can't.
And that's a good way to also gauge and track the severity of it. If let's say it amplifies or worsens.
Yeah, you have a running record.
Yeah.
Okay,
exactly.
What was the one you were going to say?
The one I was going to say is, it all fits together in a way. There's some crossover and overlaps, but you maintain and put together a timeline or a log, which also, by the way, chronicles how exactly it impacted you. So, for instance, whether it's loss of use or adding to your costs or requiring you to store things someplace, clearly
Our family of 4 now has only one bathroom to use because we have 2 in the house and 1 is unusable.
Exactly.
Write down everything.
Put them on notice of all of that. Yeah.
Right. And so what he just said is important. You've got your written notices, your emails or whatever to the management, to the board, but timeline. Keep that personal timeline. Water intrusion event started here. Damage to this started here. Damage to this was getting worse. Damage to this has now gotten worse. And put pictures along. See photograph 3 through 6. 3 photographs 7 through 11. See video 1 through 2. Whatever it is. Organize.
It adds so much substance and credibility to your cause because now that's difficult to deny, if not impossible.
You give us
gold.
You give us gold. You give us sharpened, honed weapons that we can aim at the HOA and pierce through any shielding they might have. Okay? Obviously, in writing, again, you demand immediate action because it's a leak. Water intrusion requires immediacy always. It's always an emergency. Demand immediate investigation into origin, cause, damage, and mitigation. Turn the water off. Open up my walls. So if mold would start growing here, it won't. Okay, because we're going to open it up. Give me the dehumidifiers. Give me the blowers. Give me the whatever. Mitigation. Mitigation that's one of our defined words, but it's a fancy word for, hey, don't start to fix the problem. Don't make things worse.
Right.
Okay. Let's prevent further damage, whatever that is. Yeah. Okay. Insist on action, not promises of future action. Future action doesn't do you any good. Okay. And yes, notify your HO6 carrier, notify your agent if you've got one. You are it's called, you're tendering a claim. May or may not be covered. That's going to be between you and them to decide. But you have to do that because A, you don't want to waive your right to coverage if it is covered, and B, they can be, if it's a good insurance company, and there are a few, they can be very helpful in getting the HOA's master policy people, whoever holds that policy, to get off their butt. Because I guarantee you, your insurance company is going to reach out to their insurance company. So get a hold of your insurance company and report it. Whether you think it's covered or not is irrelevant. Report it anyway.
And by the way, in instances where your HO6 sends someone out to look at the issue, they may provide you with something that you may be usable.
Well, exactly, which is kind of leads to the next one.
Yeah.
When you notify your HO6 policy people, also ask for, because you're entitled under 5200, ask for a copy of the HOA's master policy, the latest or most, whatever that year's policy is. Okay, get a copy of the master policy, and if you don't already have them, you want to have in your possession the CC&Rs, so that you can look on or in the CC&Rs for the allocation of or the classification and allocation of costs for the different components involved in the water intrusion. You want to know kind of, okay, I don't know what the origin point is here, but if the origin's here, I want to know who's responsible. If the origin turns out to be me, I want to know who's responsible.
Yeah.
So get the master policy and get the CC&Rs if we don't already have them.
Yeah.
And lastly, and I think this is a good one, ask, you're not assuming anything nefarious here, but ask for a definitive timeline or estimate from whoever you're reaching out to, your board, your management, whatever, as to the repair timeline and the mitigation timeline. So in other words, in addition to all the stuff I've asked for above, please give me a realistic timeline as to when you expect repairs to be commenced, completed, and when you expect remediation to be commenced and completed. Often remediation won't begin until parts, the first part is started. For example, the opening up of the walls. You can't remediate until that's done. Now, often it's the same company doing it, so it's all at once. But get a timeline on the repairs and mitigation and remediation so that you can hold them to it, okay? Now, they might say, well, we can't give you one right now. That might work for the first day or two max, but after that, that's BS. You deserve a timeline. Insist on one and keep writing until you get one.
And certainly once vendors are engaged, they are to provide you some idea.
They have to.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, this approach does two things at the same time. It pressures the HOA to act, and it creates a record in case they don't. Okay? The record won't matter if your HOA is a good HOA and they do everything they're supposed to do. None of this record will end up mattering. Yeah. You're not preparing for the best. You're preparing for the worst. Okay? Luck favors the prepared. So be one of the prepared.
Indeed.
Okay? Because when disputes escalate like we've been describing, that written record of yours is going to be, as Sam said, worth its weight in platinum. He said gold. I'm going to say platinum. Okay? So please, 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 please do yourself, do us, if you come to us, do anybody a favor and document the hell out of this thing. Okay? All right, folks, we're at the end here. Water intrusion disputes are rarely decided by a single leak or a single component that fails. Okay? They're decided by documents, timelines, and conduct both before and after the water intrusion event. The documents we're talking about could be anything from your CC&Rs, allocation, to the respective insurance policies. Okay? When HOAs investigate promptly, they apply the CC&Rs correctly, and they act reasonably throughout the process. They're just decent human beings, these directors. When they do that, then most water intrusion events get resolved without any escalation, and they get resolved pretty quickly, okay? When HOAs delay, act in bad faith, ignore the governing documents, rely solely on shortcuts, do everything they can to interfere, to service some benefit of saving the HOA money, even if justified or legal or not, that's when disputes arise, and none of those actually ever needed to exist, okay? If your HOA is one of those bad HOAs that is doing any of those, denying responsibility, improperly shifting costs, dragging their feet, or delaying in pre or post water intrusion mitigation or fixes or any of those things like that, and nothing you're doing is working, or if you get the impression that your HOA is going to be one of those ones that's just going to be a problem from the beginning, that's when you call us at MBK Chapman, and we will set your HOA straight. If you like this episode, please hit the like button. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel HOA Hell. If you'd like to ask a question or leave a comment, please do so. Until next time, have a wonderful day.